Well, once again, everyone, good morning for the third time. And thank you, Bob, for letting the light go up. I can't read in the dark as well as I used to be able to. My name is John Carroll, and I am the second vice president of the Foundation for Restoration. And it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Mark Wagner is professor and director of the Center for Archaeological Investigations at SIU Carbondale. His interests include the prehistory and early history of both Native Americans and Europeans in the Illinois and the lower Ohio River valleys. He is particularly interested in the cultural contact between Native Americans and Euro-Americans and the outcomes of such contacts as they affected both groups. Dr. Wagner has studied and written about Native American rock art in Illinois. Please welcome Dr. Mark Wagner, who will present Bound to the Western Waters, Recent Archaeological Investigations at Fort Kaskaskia, Illinois. Welcome.
Well, good morning. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm a professor at SIU Carbondale, and about 6 years ago in 2017, I was asked to teach the Archaeology Field School. What that is, it's a 6-week class we hold every summer, and we teach students how to excavate, how to dig properly, how to map, how to take photographs, how to take notes. And so we do that every summer, and we've been holding it at Fort Kaskaskia since 2017. I asked the state in 2017 if we could hold the class up there, and they agreed. And I wanted to hold it there because really very little is known about that fort. And as you're going to see, so little is known that there actually are 2 forts up there that the state never knew they owned. And so that's why we're up there. Part of the there's an ethic in archaeology that you really shouldn't excavate at sites that are on state or public land because they're already being protected. But sometimes you get into a situation where so little is known about the site that it is getting damaged, like by park activities or whatever else, because they really don't know it. They don't know where it is or where its edges are. So that's what we're doing up there, is trying to give the state more information about this fort. And these are some of the groups that have helped us out. We got funding from the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. But we have Native American Indian groups that have been helping us. The Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma have helped us. And the United Kituwa Band Cherokee have helped us. And this is also the U.S. Forest Service. So this is kind of a joint project by a number of people. And we're only there for 6 weeks each summer because it's a class. It usually runs from late May to early June. We're going to be back there for at least one more year, next year, hopefully. Let's see if we can. And this is what I think most of you probably know what Fort Kaskaskia looks like. It was made a state park, I think, in the 1930s. And this is the French fort as it appears today. It's like low hills, low mounds. Those 2 people there are actually standing on one of the walls of the fort. And but this is really interesting up here. The first map we have of that French fort is from 1765, and it's drawn by a British engineer. And you can see he only shows 2 structures in there. He shows a barracks and a kitchen. This is a satellite image that we got access to in 2017. And you can see how accurate his map was. That is pretty amazing. That he was such a good engineer, such a good mapper. Looks exactly the same. The main difference is a huge sinkhole has developed off the edge of the fort since he made his map, and it's actually impacted one of the bastions of the fort. I believe that's probably the southeast bastion. One of the first things you see when you get up there is a sign that was put up there in the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial saying not only is this a French fort, but the U.S. Army rebuilt it in 1803, and Lewis and Clark stopped here. They recruited 11 men for their expedition, and also they picked up supplies. That's kind of partially true, not entirely true. But when we started work up there, we thought, well, this is true. When we get up there, not only are we going to find the remains of the French fort, we're going to run into an American fort as well. And this is what the French fort supposedly looked like. This is when you go up there to the fort, you'll see an interpretive plaque that has this image on it. And I like this because what it does is show you the relationship of the fort to the town of Kaskaskia. And that's what it was supposed to protect. It's on the other side of the Kaskaskia River, on the bluffs overlooking the fort. So overlooking the town. That's why it survives today. But this shows it under construction, and they're working on the barracks, and they were working on the kitchen in the corner, and nothing else. This is not entirely accurate, although it's supposedly showing you the fort under construction. This fort is actually a logged fort. In this case, the logs have not been put on the exterior of the fort yet, but it kind of gives you a misleading impression of what that fort looked like. This is what the fort looked like, and we know that from accounts by a couple of British officers who saw it in 1765. The British arrived 2 years after the end of the French and Indian War to take possession of the Illinois country. They hadn't been able to get there earlier because of Pontiac's rebellion. And when they arrived, they saw the fort up on the bluff top, and it was unfinished and partially collapsing already. And what had happened is the French abandoned it when they found out that they had lost the French and Indian War. But it's a typical fort for the Great Lakes area. And here's another one that's from a French fort from up on the Great Lakes. And it's exactly the same with these horizontal logs on the outside. But they're really crowded with buildings inside. This one never was because it was never finished. It was abandoned before it was completed. And this again is the first map we have of it. We do not have a French map of it. The only map we have of it is this map made by this British engineer. He's part of the Black Watch. And they arrive in 1765, the 42nd Highlanders. And you can see here is his map of the fort again. But again, he also mapped the town of Kaskaskia. So once again, it gives you the relationship of that fort to the town down there. Again, this is a highly accurate map that he made. And we have descriptions also. And I think when the state put the interpretive plaque up, they were unaware of these descriptions, but there's also descriptions written by British officers. And they describe the fort as unfinished. Most of the planks and timbers are rotten. The ditch, the parapet, and the ramparts are entirely overgrown with bushes. The northwest gate has a drawbridge which remains drawn up. A year later, another officer visited it and said, the barracks, if it ever was habitable, is not habitable now. It doesn't have doors, it doesn't have windows, it doesn't have floorings, it doesn't have a covering. So what's going on is that the people in Kaskaskia, once this fort is abandoned, they're using it as a Lowe's or a Home Depot. They're coming up to get stuff out of the fort. They're taking all the ironwork out of the fort. They probably take all the logs off the side of it. And so very rapidly, when the British see it, it's already in bad shape. This is only a couple of years after it was abandoned. It burned supposedly in 1766, and we have this from a couple of different British reports. And they claim that the people in Kaskaskia set fire to it on purpose to stop them from reoccupying it. And if they did, it wasn't a very good plan because the British responded by building a fort right down in Kaskaskia itself. So it did keep them out and encourage them to get even closer. Our speaker just a minute ago talked about John Dodge. That is not Dodge, that's what he may have looked like. He was a fur trader from Virginia. He had connections with George Rogers Clark. He arrived in the Illinois country with a commission in his pocket signed by Thomas Jefferson, appointing him Indian agent. And that's because at this time, Illinois is still part of the colony of Virginia. So he arrives as an Indian agent. He has terrible relationships with the people in the town of Kaskaskia. They write letters to Congress complaining about him, saying he's beating us up in the street, he's taking all our possessions. And so he's there for about 5 or 6 years. He actually puts a couple of cannon back in the fort so he can dominate the town. He leaves in 1786, supposedly driven out. And like all bad people, he flees to Missouri. When he comes back, he leads a raid on the town of Kaskaskia. He gathers up a group of Indians. He was an Indian agent. And they actually raid the town of Kaskaskia, and then he's finally driven out for good in 1787. The next big event that happens that we know of is the arrival of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1803. And part of a U.S. infantry company under the command of Captain Russell Bissell arrives up there, and they're accompanied by an artillery company under the command of Captain Amos Stoddard. And they have maybe, if these companies are full strength, there should be 120 guys. The U.S. Army during this period is notoriously understrength. If there were they only had about between 60 and 80 men between the two companies. Where they're coming from, and I'm going to refer to this a little later, they're coming from a very large Army camp in Pulaski County, Illinois, right at the southern end, that was established in 1801. And that camp is being broken up in 1801 because of disease. And Bissell's company ends up being sent up to Kaskaskia to build a fort up there to get them out of that big camp where everybody is dying. Why they're being sent up to Kaskaskia is another question. The biggest event that ever happens in the history of this fort, it's only in operation for 3 years, the American fort, is the Lewis and Clark expedition. Stops there in 1803. And by this time, the core of the expedition is formed. Lewis is there, Clark is there. Their mixed blood hunter, George Dreyer, is there. And Clark's African-American servant, York, is there. And they recruit 11 men from the garrison, and they pick up supplies also. And George Dreyer, if you don't know anything about him, is a really interesting character. And this is part of the reason we have the Shawnee helping us. He's part Shawnee, part French. He has a Shawnee mother. And he works for the Army from 1795 through the end of the expedition. So he's working for the Army for 11 years. His father, his uncle was Louis Lorimer down in Cape Girardeau. And he is such a good tracker that the Army sends him they'll send him from Fort Massac down by Cairo all the way to Cincinnati carrying messages through the woods. But also, the commander of Fort Massac says nobody will desert while he's here. The soldiers know if they desert while Dreyer is there, he'll catch them and bring them back to the fort. So he stops soldiers from deserting also, just because he is so good. And this actually is a note, a receipt signed by Meriwether Lewis at Fort Kaskaskia. And this is in the Missouri Historical Society. And they stopped there in November, late November. This is signed on December 1st. And it says, received from Captain Amos Stoddard, 50 pounds of gunpowder for the use of my command, bound to the western waters. And then later down here, they pick up another 25, and then another 100 pounds. And they get 175 pounds of gunpowder out of that fort. And a descendant of Amos Stoddard has recently suggested, and he may be right, that the whole purpose of the American Fort Kaskaskia is to preposition men and supplies for the expedition. So they're moving supplies in there, they're moving men. The Lewis and Clark come by and pick up these supplies and pick up these men. And they do recruit 11 men out of the garrison. After that, both forts just disappear into obscurity. The American fort goes out of operation in 1806. The French fort never went into operation. And people start getting interested in the late 1800s, again, for the first time. Hiram Beckwith is the founder of the Illinois State Historical Society. He's also a trained surveyor. And he made a map of the French fort in, I think it's 1895. It's the first map we have since the 1765 map. And his map is a little too exact. He's got measurements in there that are all the same. Like he'll have this bastion is 18 feet, 18 feet, 18 feet, 18 feet, 18 feet, 18 feet. And so it's too exact. It's more of a sketch map. But what he's showing you is there already is damage occurring to the fort in 1895. A ditch is, that huge sinkhole I showed you earlier, apparently is already forming. And all the water is running through the fort, and it's wiped out the southeast bastion to the fort. And then this is the barracks, the French barracks. And he also shows, well, that's all he can see on the surface. And the question is, how did he see that French barracks? How did he see it? The only thing could have been the foundation stones must have been visible, but they're not visible today. At the same time, this is a photograph taken, it was published in 1905, but it actually was taken around 1900. It's by a man named George Washington Smith. He's a history professor at SIU. He gets interested in the town of Kaskaskia and Fort Kaskaskia. He's also a photographer, so he takes the first photographs of the French fort. And his photographs really aren't a whole lot of use. It's just kind of nice to have them. But you can see a bastion of the fort here. It's heavily overgrown with trees. Following that, no more interest in the fort till the 1970s. And then this archaeologist arrives, also from SIU. His name is Charles Orser. And this man arrives. He is a remote sensing investigator from the University of Illinois. And Orser does the first archaeological excavations ever done in the fort. And you can see his units. These little hatched squares are his units. And this is something that sometimes happens in archaeology. See that orange line? That's the foundation of the French barracks. And it's falling between his units. He never found it because he had his units off by about a foot. And so when we were up there, we ran into it. And we were completely surprised. And then we went back to his map and found out what had happened. This is Weymouth's magnetometer map that he did, or gradiometer map he did in 1980. I was up there at the time he did that. I was only about this big. I was a wee child, just a little tight, but I was up there. And I could not interpret that map when he did it, and I still can't interpret it. I remember talking to him about it, and he was trying to show me all sorts of things. I was like, oh, I can see it real clearly. And, but it is one of the first gradiometry surveys ever done in North America, and it was done at Fort Kaskaskia. This is where we have been working. We started up there in 2017, and we started outside the fort. The reason I did that is because one is we were teaching students how to excavate. They don't know how to excavate. So we started them outside the fort so they wouldn't hurt anything inside the fort. And also, this area had never been looked at. When Orser did his work, he excavated in this area. He excavated over here. Didn't look outside the fort. So the question is, what's outside the fort? Is there anything out there that we need to know about that the state needs to protect? And these other things, these hash lines or dash lines, those are our remote sensing blocks. We were using both ground penetrating radar and a gradiometer to look for things under the surface. And they both work on different principles. Radar is, I know you're all familiar with that, just like an airplane. It sends a signal out that hits a hard object and sends you a signal back. So if there's a foundation under the ground, that radar can detect it. It can also detect, as we found out, lots of tree roots. They're also very hard. A magnetometer works on a little different principle. It can locate disturbed areas in the ground. It's very good at locating iron. It can locate places where people have had fires, that are now under the ground. So the two of them together complement each other. This is what a GPR map looks like. And these are all of the same block. And this is one of our students, and she is pushing the ground penetrating radar unit. It looks just like a lawnmower. You have to systematically push it across the ground. And this is what it's showing you at ground surface. All these, it isn't like an X-ray. You have to have an operator who's skilled at interpreting it. All these red dots or anomalies or things it's detecting under the ground. And when you get to 35, they start to decrease a little bit. And at 65, this thing popped up. And this is a very strong signal that showed up. And I think in this block right here at 65 centimeters under the ground. So we wanted to know these other things are tree roots. And that is, you have to get down below the tree roots to be able to see anything. And the radar does reflect off those tree roots. And this is what was there. This is what the radar located. It was a pit dug into the ground, and we do not know how old it is. It is a colonial era pit, means it could be French, it could be British, it could be American. It's got French gun flints in it and melted lead. So somebody has got a fire outside the fort, and they're making lead bullets or casting lead bullets. But there's nothing else that is diagnostic in there, like French ceramics or anything like that. All we know is that it dates to the 1700s, early 1800s, but it does indicate that the fort extends outside its walls. People who are living in that fort are doing things outside the walls. And this was the big thing we found. This again is that map from the 1760s. And because the fort's unfinished, the French only managed to build 2 buildings. They built a barracks, and they built a kitchen in the corner. And the kitchen actually had been located by Charles Orser in the 70s. And this is, I'll show it again to you in a second. It is just an area of darker soil running through this one unit. This was the big surprise. There is still the French barracks has a stone foundation. There was no mention of this ever in any sort of historic account before we went out there. So when we ran into it, it was a big surprise. And this is, oops, let me see if I can do this. This is what Orser found in the 70s. He found a trench with burned posts in it, and we were able to find another wall of that structure to confirm what he found. And this is it cleaned out. It's just a trench dug into the ground. And what it is, it's like these structures here in some of the structures in St. Genevieve. It's a post-in-ground structure where the French are digging a trench and they're putting posts inside of it. And these are some of the things that came out of it. Not much, but they were the first French artifacts we found in the fort. A nail, I think he's holding a nail, and she's holding the neck of a brandy bottle. And those both came out of that wall trench. And this again is our big surprise when we ran into this. This is the foundation of the French barracks. And that is actually the corner of it. And it's still in place and got mortar holding it together. That's a side view of it. And where it is, if you look at the map from the 1895, it's that corner of the barracks. And she is standing, Tamira is standing right at the corner. It's going to turn and run off this way. And the cool thing about it is, well, we didn't know what sort of a foundation. It potentially could have been a foundation to a stone building, stone barracks like at Fort Deschartres. All this rubble is spilled out around it. And there's the foundation again, and over there. But what it turns out, it is a post-on-sill structure like here in St. Genevieve, where you have stone infill between all the upright posts. And this actually is a really cool photograph. This is the foundation. See all these stones on edge? That is the infill collapsed down. That was between 2 vertical posts, and it has fallen out. This is just all the rubble that surrounds that foundation. Another thing we wanted to check out, and this again gets into knowing what is out there, is that there is a cellar inside the French barracks. And a lot of times, and especially a place that's been a park for 100 years, park workers or somebody could easily have excavated that cellar and taken everything out of it. So we didn't know what was in there, and neither did the state. So we excavated a test unit inside of it. And it turned out the cellar was still there. It runs 1.2 meters deep, which is about 4 feet. And it still contains intact deposits from the era of the fort. When you get down to the very bottom, you can see burned soil. here, and that is from the fire that destroyed part of the barracks in 1766. And all above it is just park debris. So apparently this cellar was empty almost to the bottom, and during the history of the park they threw in all this debris, and this is just washed in soil at the top. But we were able to demonstrate well, for two things. One is it contained evidence that the fort indeed did burn, part of it did burn, and it did contain some artifacts at the very bottom. We didn't excavate the whole thing. This is just a sample. That's all we wanted to know about it. These are the things we've been getting inside the French fort. And we didn't find this. We didn't find this. We're finding little tiny fragments. These are like creamware plates from the English creamware. So it's the English or Americans are in the fort. I suspect really these are U.S. Army, probably. They were using creamware plates. But we did get French faience, French ceramics like you see here in the interpretive center here, that are coming off something like this. But you can see how tiny they are. They're like a centimeter each. We get a lot of nails too, and so that's another question is, why is there so little in this fort, and why is it all so small? And I'll get to that in a little bit as to what I think is going on. These are some other items we found. I think this actually came out of the bakehouse. It is the neck to a brandy bottle. When this was found, it was dark green, and when these old green bottles are exposed to the soil, the surface starts exfoliating and it turns gold. So that is a reaction after it was taken out of the ground. We did get a little lead bullet, lots of nails to the fort, and they're kind of interesting because a number of them are pulled. They got curved shafts. So some sort of remodeling is going on inside that fort. The nails are being pulled out and thrown down on the ground and discarded. This was a unique item. And this came out outside the fort. And again, if we had looked out there, we never would have found it. Historians in Illinois, around the turn of 1900, argued incessantly whether Fort Kaskaskia was ever used during the Revolutionary War. And they finally concluded, no, it was not. All the action took place down in the town of Kaskaskia. Yet we recovered a British uniform button to the King's 8th Regiment of Foot right outside the fort walls. And this is what it would look like if it was complete. And these are reenactors dressed in that uniform. So what's going on? I think what is going on is this. George Rogers Clark captured Kaskaskia in 1778, but in 1779 he launched an expedition against Vincennes, Indiana, because the British had retaken it, and he captured 30 members of the King's 8th Regiment of Foot at Vincennes in 1779. Now those guys were all sent as prisoners back to Virginia, but I'm willing to bet their coats didn't go with them. And somebody is wearing a British, he and his men ruined their clothing because they did this in February, in the middle of winter, and they waded through water up to their necks. So I think the British got relieved of their coats and they're worn back. And who was wearing this coat? It could have been an Indian. It could have been one of Clark's men. It could have been one of John Dodge's men. We just don't know. We do know it's a Revolutionary War uniform button. And the other thing that's possible is that Clark himself, he captured Kaskaskia because the British were not keeping a watch at Fort Kaskaskia. So he may actually be leaving men up at Fort Kaskaskia as a guard, so that if the British come back, he'll be warned and won't be caught unaware like they were. But this is what we didn't find our first 3 years out there. We have found no trace of the Lewis and Clark expedition. These are the sorts of things we should have found. Uniform buttons, other parts of uniforms, equipment. Didn't find any of that. We didn't find any evidence that the U.S. Army had rebuilt that fort. Yet we've got this sign out there that says they did it, and we know that there are historic documents that say there was a Fort Kaskaskia, an American Fort Kaskaskia. So where is it? Well, we looked up the road at a place called, of all things, Garrison Hill. I tell my students, this is called a clue. Why is this hill called Garrison Hill? And I would ask people, and nobody knew. It said it's always been its name. I said, well, because there was a U.S. Army garrison up there. Anyway, we went up there, and that is the site of the American fort that was built in 1803. They're about 100 yards apart. And we went up there, and one of the park workers gave us this. He had found this while they were repairing a water main up there, and it is a United States 2nd Infantry button. That is Bissell's company. That is the infantry soldiers who were up there, who later went on the Lewis and Clark expedition. We also saw like hundreds of broken brick fragments everywhere that are low-fired bricks that would have gone to the chimneys of the fort. They're out there everywhere, scattered over the ground. And this is where the fort is. It is on both sides of the road. The road runs through the center of it. The road was built in the 1930s, and I don't really think it did much damage to the fort because the foundation trenches to the fort, things like that, and cellars are much deeper. So it may have clipped off the top foot or something, but it didn't get everything that was deep. But what they did do was they pushed all this fill to this direction. So there's a big jumble on this side, and later on it's impacted by water lines because they didn't know the fort was, the remains of the fort were there. So it's got artifacts associated with the fort, but it's pretty messed up. This side is the cemetery that holds the people who were removed from Kaskaskia in the late 1800s, as the cemeteries on Kaskaskia were being destroyed by the Mississippi River. And this is what we found. It turns out, yeah, there's a lot of stuff on the east side of the road. These are all brandy bottle fragments, a lock to a chest, pieces of iron furniture. So there are artifacts associated with the fort, but they're all kind of a jumble. They've all been pushed up in a big pile. And there's probably something intact underneath of them, but it's so difficult to dig up there because of all the brick. So anyway, we had concluded, or I had concluded, that since we found this American fort, the American Army never, ever, ever was in the French fort, and that the state needed to change their sign up there. And then, surprise, I think it was in 2021, we ran into this, and it is a big U.S. Army trash pit inside the French fort. That's why the dark stain, it's full of organic material. And this, people are excavating it, and Felipe is standing in it, and it has curved sides and a rounded bottom. This is only 1/4 of it. It's a big pit. And they probably dug this with a hoe or a mattock. And this came out of the very bottom of it. It's iron adze. But you could have used it to dig a pit. So some U.S. Army soldier may have said, I'm done with digging pits and trash pits, and threw it at the bottom and it got covered up. But it dawned on me that I had seen this same thing before. When I excavated Continuities, Wilkinson, which is down in Pulaski County, in 2003, and it's the exact same soldiers. This is where Bissell's company came from. They were here a year earlier. They're doing the same thing. They're digging these big, round, circular trash pits and taking all their trash in it, and they're burning it. And the reason they're doing that is they have, anytime you got U.S. Army soldiers or any soldiers together in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they started dying. They started dying from dysentery. They started dying from malaria. A lot of these camps were just filthy. And in 1801, they lost at least 100 guys at Continuities, Wilkinson to disease. And they only had 800 soldiers there. So they lost like 12%, 13% of their garrison just to disease. And the commanding officer, who was Benjamin Franklin's nephew, Major Jonathan Williams, he said, I want this place cleaned up. And so he issued orders that 3 times a week, soldiers were to go through the fort and pick up every piece of trash, and it was to be taken to those pits. There were dig pits, and that trash went in there, and they were to burn it up. And Continuities, Wilkinson is a lot like Fort Kaskaskia. You can't find a U.S. Army artifact outside of these trash pits because they're picking everything up and dragging it there. And so this is what's going on at Fort Kaskaskia. This is why we find so little inside the fort. The U.S. Army soldiers are under orders still to clean up that fort and keep it clean. This is how we knew once again that it was them doing it. This is a 2nd Infantry button that came out right above that pit with a 2 on the center. And this is what it looks like, a replica of it looks like today. This was the big surprise that came out of that U.S. Army pit. These are Native American made stone pipes. They're mixed in with all the U.S. Army artifacts. And they're being abandoned, they're being broken and abandoned while they're being made. So they're mistakes. And this one is a partially drilled one. You can tell the hole only goes part way in. This one you can't see the interior, but it's the same. It was broken and thrown away. So what's going on? Who is doing this? It either means that there's a Native American up there, but it's also possible they've got someone like George Greer, who we know was associated with the U.S. Army and worked, he's a mixed blood, he's a Métis. He works for the Army as a hunter and an interpreter and a scout. He would have grown up in a Shawnee Indian village, and he would have known how to do this. And a guy like him never appears on Army rolls. Unless you get them mentioned in a letter, you never know they're out there. So it's possible that there's somebody like this, a Native American who's working for the Army, who's up there, and he's taking the intact pipes away with him, and the mistakes are being thrown away in that pit. And this is it. This is what they're doing. The U.S. Army continues it today. These guys are policing their camp, picking up all the trash. And that's what's going on at Fort 1 and why we can't find any French or U.S. Army artifacts inside of it. So now, I grudgingly admit they don't have to move their sign anymore. You know that they're in there. I'll let them off the hook. They can leave the sign there. This again is the American fort, 100 yards away, a football field length away. And it is, again, the road runs through the center of it. Our vans are parked on top of it. It's on that side of the road, and it's on this side of the road. And the first graves in the cemetery start down here. And this is an obelisk that was placed, I think it's 1891, by the state of Illinois to commemorate the cemetery. And we came across the road in 2021, 2022 with the permission of the state because this area really is outside the cemetery. The first graves start down here. Plus we had 2 people with us who were, whose specialty is analyzing human remains. So we could have, if we had hit a human bone, we would have known it. And we have yet to find anything like that. So we are outside of the cemetery. What the American fort looked like, different from the French fort. This is Fort Dearborn. It was built at the same time as Fort Kaskaskia on the same plan. It has got vertical stockade lines around it, and the buildings are right up against the walls. If this is accurate, and it's got a parade ground in the center that has nothing in it, where the soldiers form up several times a day. And this is Fort Dearborn under construction. And again, it's built at the same time as Fort Kaskaskia by the same soldiers, 1st and 2nd Regiment of Infantry soldiers. And if this drawing is accurate, what it shows you is that they're digging deep trenches. And they've got these huge poles for the stockade, and they're putting them in. For those poles to remain upright, those trenches had to be about 5 or 6 feet deep. So despite all the disturbance, we ought to find them. And we did. And this is where we worked initially. The first several years we were on the north side, east side of the road. Artifacts were heavily disturbed. And then we shifted and came down here. And this is the interesting unit. This is where we actually hit the stockade line to the fort, or a cellar to the fort. And then this is another unit over here where we found a lot of ceramics that would belong to the officers and their wives. And this was pretty exciting. We found this in, I think, right before COVID hit. I think we found it in 2019. And there is a big dark stain that appeared in our trench. And we probed it, and it runs down about 5 feet into the ground. So what it is, it may be a cellar to the fort, and this is what I'm talking about because it's so deep. But we weren't able to get back to it because of COVID for 2 years. And, oops, wrong button again. We came back in 2021, and this is where that dark stain was. It's covered with tarp. It hasn't been opened up yet. And we expanded that unit. We wanted to see what was around it and how far that ran. And this is what it looked like. This dark stain that is filled with rocks is the cellar, and it's been intentionally filled in. Cellars fall into disuse. They can absorb odors. Something gets spilled in them. The Army abandons it, and they start getting filled in with refuse because they're deep holes that need to be filled in. And this is the approximate location of that cellar. And the significance of that was, again, this is it under excavation, and we confirmed that it was a cellar. It actually has a step leading into it. So you would have stepped in here. We didn't do that excavating. That step is original. And you go down, and it has a flat floor. So unlike those trash pits I showed you earlier, this was dug with a shovel. It has straight walls and a flat bottom at the bottom. And there's no doubt that it's a cellar. And it ran 1.1 meter deep under the present ground surface, which is about 4 feet. And this is what came out of it. We excavated only a quarter of that cellar. We got 150 1st and 2nd infantry buttons, artillery buttons, off buttons that belong to officers. We got items of daily living like smoking pipes, a red worm milk pan. She's holding lead waste from casting lead bullets. And one of the questions is, why are they throwing away all these uniform buttons? There's probably 600 buttons in it. If we go back and excavate the rest of it, we'll get 600 or 700 buttons total. So why are they doing that? Bissell's company is the one that goes up to St. Louis in 1804 to represent the United States at the cession of the Louisiana Territory. I would guess their uniforms are really ratty. And they have received a new shipment of uniforms, and they're pitching these old uniforms down into that cellar, which is already abandoned and already getting filled up. You just don't lose this many buttons. So it is, uniform coats are being thrown down into that cellar for some reason. And it may be that that's what they're up to. This was something that was really interesting also that came out of there. Soldiers in the early 1800s wore leather stocks around their necks, and they're fastened with brass clasps at the back. And this is to protect your neck from a saber blow. And this is why United States Marines are called leathernecks, because they wore this sort of collar. And the name stuck to them, it didn't stick to the Army. But in excavating that cellar, we found these before, these parts of these brass clasps. And this one, here is that brass clasp. It's this one right here, but attached to it still was part of the leather collar. And that's the first time I've ever found a piece of the leather collar. And it's not much, but it was pretty cool to actually find one of those. So here it is. This is what was important about finding a cellar. We know they're along the walls of the building. We know they're under buildings, and we know the buildings are along the walls. And this is a reconstructed U.S. Army building at Fort Massac. And if it's accurate, it shows that that building is right along the stockade line. So this cellar is right there. The stockade line has to be right next to it. And this also is a map from Fort Dearborn. And it shows the same thing. It shows a big building along the stockade. All the buildings are along the stockade lines. So this means with this cellar, we've got to be along the stockade line. And so now that we had an idea where it was, we brought our GPR unit back out, and we brought our magnetometer back out to see what they could detect in that area right next to the cellar. And this is what they detected. They detected the stockade line. And I had them put paper plates out there because I knew they wouldn't have the data done in time for me to show at a meeting. But it's also a pretty nice representation. And you can see the units we dug over top of it to confirm that it is indeed the stockade line, and it runs right underneath that 1891 monument. It is so deep it probably survives underneath that monument. This is Felipe, and he is doing his thesis on the remote sensing of Fort Kaskaskia. He's got the magnetometer unit on his back that's a GPS antenna. So we don't even have to map where he is. We know it's automatically recorded wherever he's walking. So we know we have that information. And this is what he saw. Again, you have to interpret this. You have to have somebody who knows what it means. But these red and yellow images up here are the stockade line appearing. What you should get is this blue. But when we got the red and yellow, that is the stockade line showing up. And here is William Morrison's grave. He was one of the richest men in Kaskaskia. And he is buried very close to the stockade line. That's his iron coffin. That's a signal from his iron coffin projecting northward. It's got such a strong signal. Even though we didn't go over it, it's projecting eastward. It's projecting eastward. So now we know Morrison was buried in an iron coffin, which is not a big surprise considering how wealthy he was, but it was interesting to pick up. But this is, again, the important thing is this shows that digging where we are, we're safe. We're not going to run into the cemetery. These are the earliest graves, the edge graves in the cemetery. So digging here, we are not going to run into anybody buried in that cemetery. And again, you can see how deep these trenches are. So they should still be there. We picked it up, then we had to go out and confirm if it was there. And we found it. This is it being excavated. After the soil's been removed, it runs about 4.6 feet down into the ground. This is it when it first appeared over here. It's this kind of dark stain against the yellow soil. And then over on this side, all these things inside of it are where posts have been pulled. Somebody has dismantled that fort, and the posts are filling in with soil where the posts would have been. And this is what I'm talking about. There's a whole series of posts in that trench. So, another thing located by the remote sensing was this. I think the radar picked this up. There's a cluster of limestone, flat slabs laying on the surface, and they're heavily burned, and they're stacked. And the radar found them right below the ground, and that stockade trench ends at these rocks. The rest of the fort, the chimneys in the fort are brick, so where are they getting the stone for the stockade line? I'm willing to bet they were down in the French fort dismantling that foundation and bringing stone slabs up here. And this is what, you can kind of see these are stacked, and if we had a better image, you could see that these are burned red. They're probably a firebox like this underneath a blockhouse, which is what you would have found at the corner of that fort. So we may have found one of the blockhouses to that fort. So we're going to be back there next year. You can come visit us. We're there in May and June. And what we're going to do next year, it might be the last year we're up there. I'm not getting any younger. And we're going to complete the remote sensing. We're going to look for the other stockade lines. We've only got one. We need to find all four if we want to protect this fort. We've got to find its other three stockade lines. So we're going to have the GPR unit out there and the magnetometer. They're also diagonal from that limestone hearth or firebox I showed you is another cluster of limestone on the surface. It may be it may be an opposing blockhouse to the fort. So we're going to identify that also, and then we're going to be looking for the stockade lines. And then finally, the last thing I have to show you, what happened to the two forts? The French fort is still there. It probably was stripped of all its lumber, stripped of all its iron hardware, but it's still there. And so that's why they made a state park about it. They never knew that the American fort was there, and the reason is this. It was probably dismantled for its lumber and sold off real quickly after the Army left. That land did not belong to the Army. It belonged to John Edgar and Kaskaskia. The Army only had a 3-year lease on it. And in 1806, they pulled out, and that land reverted to Edgar. And he was the richest man in Kaskaskia, and he probably never passed up a chance to make $1. And he probably had that fort dismantled. You can't find a single traveler's account of anybody ever having seen this fort, yet it existed. It's very odd. So, and it's in a prominent place. So it disappeared very quickly from the landscape, whereas the French fort did not. And this again gets back to what the descendant of Amos Stoddard said about that this fort may have been constructed for the Lewis and Clark expedition. It's abandoned in 1806, the same year Lewis and Clark come back. It's under construction the year they start, and it's abandoned 3 years later. And the Army specifically entered a 3-year lease with Edgar. So they intended to abandon that fort in 3 years. And so it may be that that is its primary purpose, that it's got some sort of purpose for the expedition. So this is one of the most kind of fun parts about it, is we've had Native American kids and other volunteers involved with this. In 2017, this is from them. This is George Greer, Clark's interpreter and hunter, who's part Shawnee. So we had kids from the Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma come out and help us. And the cool thing about that is they're not only recovering their heritage as American people, they're recovering their heritage as Shawnee. This is when a Shawnee tribal member was out there. And then, and here we are at the Overlook. Every year we do a photo in the town of Kaskaskia is in the back. And the Shawnee kids are mainly over on this side. There's some other in the back row. And a couple of other years we've had United Kituwa Band Cherokee come out and help us. And these are some of the Cherokee here. And I think this guy is Cherokee. This kid is Cherokee. Maybe this kid over here. So we've also had Cherokee come out and help us, which is fun to be able to work with these kids. And then the Lewis and Clark expedition members, actually, they're very old now, but they actually came out and helped us in 2018. So we actually had them out there as well. You know, we had a public event out there where we got the Lewis and Clark Discovery group from St. Louis to come down and hold a public event with us. And that was pretty cool because, you know, they're discovering, these guys are dressed as 1st and 2nd Infantry soldiers. They're actually watching part of a 1st and 2nd Infantry post be recovered. And that is all I have to show you, I think. So if you have any questions? Yeah.
Was Fort Gage, was that down in the city?
There was, Fort Gage is the fort in Kaskaskia itself. But in the around late 1800s or early 1900s, there's a lot of misunderstanding. They think the French fort is Fort Gage. So they'll put Fort Gage on the maps. And they'll say, this is Fort Gage. And there's a town down at the bottom that was like a little railroad stop, and they called that little town Fort Gage also. And that's all a mistake. Fort Gage is really over in the town of Kaskaskia. You know? But it's just late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, there was confusion about Fort Gage. There was confusion about Fort Kaskaskia. And so they said, yeah, this is Fort Gage. This is the fort that Clark attacked up here on the bluff top. And it wasn't. He may have been up there. I guarantee you he was up there, but he didn't attack that fort. So. And all these artifacts we get, at some point, they're going to be in the Illinois State Museum. That's where they have to go. And if the state ever wants it, that's part of the state of Illinois. And they can be gotten out if the state ever builds an interpretive center there. So all that stuff comes back out. We don't keep it. By our contract, we have to, when we're done out there, they have to go to them. So, which is a good thing. And all our records and all our notes and all our photographs. So that if somebody wants to go out and expand on our work 50 years from now, they'll have all our records. So, thank you.
Thank you.